All right, welcome everyone. Hello, I'm Logan, here with Harris County Public Library, and I am pleased to introduce Gwen Zepeda, one of the authors and editor, in this case, for an anthology series, and we'll be introducing her and interviewing her in regards to her work as a writer and editor. So thank you, Gwendolyn, for joining us. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me. Hey everyone, I'm Gwen Zepeda. I'm a multi-genre author. I've written kids books, poetry, volumes, novels, nonfiction, magazines. Most recently and most relevantly, I was the editor of an anthology called Houston Noir, which was a collection of noir stories by Houston and Houston-related authors. I was Houston's first poet laureate in 2013. If you go to my Wikipedia page, it says I was the first Latina blogger, and I worked for the first television recapping website. So that's me.
That is so interesting. I read that about the fact that you were a blogger for so long. What was it like getting started with that, especially like on the early internet?
What was it like? Well, back then you could either hard code your stuff and buy your own domain and type in your own HTML, or you could use some of the few platforms that were out there. I began my blog on GeoCities, which I think only really old people are going to remember.
I remember cities.
I was in the Soho neighborhood. And then I think I moved to, I want to say Blogger or Blogspot or something like that. When I first started, there were so few bloggers, as we called them back then, online journalers. There were so few of us that we used to meet yearly at conventions. And I think the first one was in Austin, Texas. So I was at that one. And then, of course, it became blogging. And then it sort of exploded. And now no one reads blogs anymore. So.
Yeah, I guess like now our what could be considered blogs would be things like Twitter or even like Facebook. Yeah, that is really interesting. I'm getting a few things set up. So I did kind of want to compare, especially with your experience as a writer, when it comes to blog writing, editorial writing, and even just writing a novel. What would you say the major differences are between those three?
Well, I mean, they're all obviously very different. It's almost easier to say what they have in common, which is just you want to consider your message, consider your audience, and your tone. So for me, because I do work in more than one genre, I'm more likely to have an idea first and then decide what format would be best for that idea. So it's just sort of, here's an idea. Is it long enough to sustain a novel? If not, should it be fiction or nonfiction, or does it need the abstraction of poetry, or should it just be a Facebook post, right?
Yeah, okay. I didn't even think about it that way. And I guess, like, in terms of genre ideas, that's going to evolve more into a story versus maybe a thought that you have and just wanted to kind of post.
Right.
So, with your noir series, it is a part of a really interesting collection that originally came out of New York, correct?
Right.
So, how did you end up getting involved with that?
I was invited to edit the collection. Akashic reached out to me. They had heard of me through, I think, I don't want to say the wrong name, but they had heard of me through one of their contacts, and they just reached out and asked if I'd be interested in editing the next collection, and I said yes.
Were you familiar with Akashic at that point, or was it kind of an out of the blue opportunity?
I knew who they were because they have a really famous children's book with a curse word in the name, so I can't say the name of it. It's Go the F Word to Sleep. But
Yes,
I,
yes. Okay.
I didn't know anyone there, so it was really just a hey, someone gave me your number, your email. Do you mind if we talk?
That's fantastic. So I finally have the presentation going. I apologize for that. I'm just having a few technical issues. But I think that was an excellent introduction to your work. And I'm excited to really get into the nitty gritty of what it's like to edit anthologies and also be a part of like a short story collection.
Right.
All right. So
That's me 9 years ago.
I thought it was a really great photo of you.
I don't want anybody watching to think that I submitted that photo to you guys and thought I still look this young, because I know I don't.
Oh no, no, that was the photo I found. But I thought it was fantastic and it matched with this theme. Okay, so going on to our first question. This is kind of just an overview of Gwendolyn's accomplishments as a writer and editor. She was also the first poet laureate for Houston, which I can't wait to also get into that. But our main focus today is going to be on anthologies. So starting off, what is an anthology? The basic definition is that it's a collection of selected literary pieces or passages of work or art or music in an anthology of that could be like from poetry to pretty much anything. It's just a collection of one genre or form of art or writing. So what was the first anthology that you read?
It's hard to say. I'm going to assume it was a Norton anthology, which if you've gone to college or high school, you've probably seen Norton anthologies of literature or Norton anthologies of poetry, which are basically textbooks or to be used as references for students. So they're just usually really thick books with really thin pages, like onion skin pages, with just hundreds or thousands of poems or stories. I want to say that was probably my first experience with anthologies. And I'm defining anthology as a collection by different authors, as opposed to a short story collection, which is multiple stories by one author, or a poetry collection by one author.
That is an important distinction.
I don't know if that's the real definition, but that's how I'm defining it for purposes of this discussion.
No, that totally helps. Okay. So especially as an editor, when we're looking at anthologies or even just like the noir anthologies, did you kind of like pay attention to these kind of collections before? Or was this kind of at the forefront once you accepted this project?
I love anthologies. When I started reading the Norton ones for school, I would go to Half Price Books and look for other Norton anthologies that were not assigned to me to be read, because I just really liked sampling different authors. And I thought, that was a good way to be introduced to new authors that, you didn't know much about without you having to go dive into a full novel. And then, of course, I started finding other kinds of anthologies, themed anthologies, similar to Houston Noir. I think one of the first ones I found was about Barbie dolls, and it was written, I want to say, in the late 80s or the early 90s. I found a lot of like Paris Reader, KGB Reader, just all kinds of anthologies that I really loved. So when I got invited to do this collection, it was I don't want to say it was a dream come true, because I think I was surprised to be invited, because I always thought you had to have more of a certain kind of experience to edit an anthology. So it was always something I wanted to do someday. So, I mean, I was just really excited to be asked, because I personally love anthologies, and I was excited about what kind of themes we could build into the book.
And with noir being such a central, I mean, it is like the central genre of it. I made the mistake going into it thinking that noir was strictly like detective mystery stories. And
Right.
upon like reading your introduction and then also doing my own research online, I realized that that is not the case at all. And part of the reason why I had that misconception is that I was thinking more of like film noir, which is more often like along like those hard boiled detectives from like, you know, the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Right.
But then reading your anthology and then doing more research on it, I realized that it's much deeper than that and is more of like an exploration of you know, the darker side of like cities or even country living. But I think primarily it's mostly in cities. So in your introduction, you mentioned how Houston is like has a lot of just naturally like a lot of features within it that make it a great setting for noir stories. Was there a part of Houston in particular, whenever you were kind of thinking about this, that you thought this would be a great setting for a story?
Maybe the Montrose. So let me take a couple of steps back and explain what that book was about. So Akashic Books, they had this project where they did noir books in, I don't know how it started, but it ended up being every major city in the world. So I knew what that was about. Like each city that gets an anthology, they all the stories are set in that city, but they're each set in a different neighborhood. So I knew that was the rule going in, that I would have to find a bunch of different people and they each had to write about a different neighborhood. And I think I was highly conscious that if I got to pick a neighborhood to write about, it would probably be the Montrose or River Oaks. And a lot of people agreed, because the people who signed on to write stories, a lot of them asked for the Montrose or River Oaks at first. And I had to say no, you know, first come, first serve. Like those were probably the first two neighborhoods that were picked. So I think, I don't know. I mean, I grew up in the sixth ward, so that would have been a good one. Houston has such a range of neighborhoods, and I think noir could lend itself really easily to either really poor neighborhoods or really rich neighborhoods. Or if you want a surprising story, everyone loves the surprising, oh, here's a little middle class enclave that has a dark secret, right? So pretty much anything would have worked, I would say.
And this actually leads into my one of my next questions, which is, as an editor for a collection like this, you of course have to like hand select the authors that you're going to include. So how did you end up going about that? Did you just have connections? Did you have to do research?
I had connections and I had to do research. So I'll say this because I know a lot of people listening to this are probably writers or aspiring writers. Every anthology is different. Some anthologies have what's called an open call for stories. So they may go out to different places online and just ask anyone who wants to submit a story to go ahead and do that. And in that kind of anthology, you could pay a reading fee for people to take the time to read your story and decide if it works or not. This one was invite only, so it was me reaching out to particular authors. I had a few people up front that I knew I wanted to ask, and I looked at it from a couple of different prisms, so to speak. I knew that I wanted people who already wrote noir or adjacent genres, such as like thrillers or mysteries. I knew I wanted some established authors in that genre, but I also really wanted to get people who had never written anything like that. And I wanted to get people that were representative of Houston as a whole. If you know Houston's literary scene, you know, there are a couple of groups in Houston, like the University of Houston Creative Writing Program, or Nuestra Palabra, or, you know, Metaphor. There are several groups. So I didn't want to like just pick one group and say, oh, everybody comes from this one place, right? I wanted to get a good cross section of the kinds of writers we have here. So I asked people I knew, and I asked people I knew for recommendations for people I didn't know. I did independent research and just went out and looked at a lot of writers' portfolios online and thought, oh, this person looks interesting. So I asked a few more people than I needed and then narrowed it down from there. So unfortunately, unfortunately, a couple of people submitted stories and I ended up not choosing those, but that was the way I wanted to get like the best cross section that I could.
So from start to finish, how long did that, like, I guess from research to publication, how long did that end up taking?
I'm just going to say, I'm going to do you like I started doing at work, which is admitting my weakness. I'm good at a lot of things and I'm not good at remembering time. And now that I'm comfortable saying that out loud, I don't even try. I'm going to say, how long did I have? Let's just say at the outside, the entire process, I think, took 2 years from being asked to do it to getting the book submitted. I know there was like a really tight timeline that was put on me where it was like, okay, you have 3 months to find, and I'm just saying this off the top of my head, and this is wrong. Like you have 3 months to identify. Yeah, I don't know. I don't even remember what it was. I think it was more like you need to submit the book by this time. And I made my own timeline backwards from that. But it wasn't more than 2 years for the whole thing. I can't remember how long it took to find people. I know there were a couple of missteps where, I guess I'll say this as long as I don't say the person's name, where I asked someone to do it and they didn't want to be edited by me. They submitted a story and then I gave them my edits and they were like, oh no, no one edits my work. So then they had to back out of the process once they realized they were going to be edited. So then I had to find someone else. So it wasn't like a super easy process, right? It was like any project you might manage where there were, a couple of steps back, steps forward.
Got it. I guess also to piggyback off that, and then I'll address the question that we just got. Oh my goodness, I got thrown off. It's definitely in the name, an editor that puts together an anthology. But for some reason, I just have not made the connection that you were also editing the stories themselves.
Oh, right. Totally. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, the books, that's what an editor is, right? Because the book's under my name and it's sort of, I don't want to say I'm just going to talk in third person. It's the editor's vision, right? So it would be one thing if you picked a bunch of authors and said, oh, I think these people will do the kind of story I want. And then if someone gave you something completely unexpected or badly written or sloppily written, well, you're not just going to say, oh, I guess I have to take that because I asked him to be in it. It's a cohesive vision, and you don't, anyone who's edited anything like a magazine or a newspaper knows that, some writers need more editing than others. There's a range of capabilities. Some people are really good at coming up with excellent plots, but maybe their diction is sloppy or they can't spell. And some people are really clean writers, but then maybe they need help making the story more interesting or easier to understand. So you obviously want the book to be as good as it can be, but it becomes sort of a matter of respect, right? It wouldn't be fair if I accepted a story from you and everyone else was a super veteran writer that had a really polished story, and then yours needed a lot more help. But then I said, well, I'm just going to let Logan submit whatever they want because, yeah, whatever. And then yours goes in and everyone else's is polished. And then everyone reads the book and says, wow, it looks like Logan could have used some editing. And I'm just picking on you because, so it just.
It's okay. I'm the only person here.
So it's not I've worked at jobs where you need a one voice edit, where you want everything to look like one person wrote it. And that's kind of what a newspaper is. Like you have a style guide to make sure that everything sounds like, okay, Washington Post wrote this or New York Times wrote this. And you don't necessarily, unless it's an op-ed, you don't hear the writer's voice. Editing an anthology is you want to leave the voice of the writer, but you want everything to have the same level of polish, right?
Um, that definitely comes true in the stories as well. My favorite story in it was the one that takes place in the museum district and is about like the young cook that's working um, at a food truck while they're also trying to like get funding for school. And it was something that spoke to me quite deeply. And reading that story, it made me realize how diverse and large noir can be. Because again, I was like, oh, it's a mystery, but it is more just like a dark slice of people's like lives and suffering, and it made me like really recontextualize the city as a whole too.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the reasons what that makes it such a great anthology. Um, do you have like a must read anthology? It's a question that we got.
Do I have a must read anthology? No, I wish I did. It's funny because I've been reading a lot of short story collections lately, and all by female writers for whatever reason, not because I'm seeking it out. That just happens to be what's happening. And I, I haven't read recent anthology. I mean, obviously you must read Houston Noir, right? And go ahead and read Akashic's other noir series, but I don't have anything recent to recommend. Sorry. I should have, like, every time I do a presentation like this, I
Mhm.
think later, oh, I should have like written down some suggestions for people, but I didn't.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I have a couple just kind of off the top of my head, and also knowing what we have in the library's collection. So I have like a little extra added help with that.
Go
Um,
for it. Huh.
we have quite a few like sci-fi anthologies, horror anthologies. I know specifically at Kingwood, I found a eldritch horror anthology, so stuff that's based off of like H.P. Lovecraft stuff. And stuff that's like recent all the way back to like the 80s and 90s. And, you know, honestly, I like reading older things to kind of compare like what's popular now to what's popular then.
Yeah.
And even then, I also have collections from school. Like I have a short story collection like way up on my shelf over here that I kept because I liked a lot of the stories that were in it. Um, and then I also have, I don't know if these would be considered anthologies, but I have like collections of short stories by specific authors. My favorite is Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. Angela Carter was a British writer. She wrote like weird fantasy novels and short stories. But other than being a writer, she was also a translator for like some of the most famous like French fairy tales. Like she helped translate like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Bluebeard, all of these like really old classics. And The Bloody Chamber is like her interpretations, like reinterpretations of those stories. And it's really, really good. And it's very short too.
Good. All right. If we can do single authors, I just read Chelsea. I'm going to say her last name is maybe pronounced Beaker, Bieker. She's the same author who wrote Godshot, which I'm told is, you know, a big deal novel. But she wrote a short story collection called Heartbroke that I loved. Um, I'm like the worst at remembering anything. There was a short story collection called Sour Heart, and I want to say the author's first name is Julie, and I can't remember her last name, but I love that book so much. Yeah, I'm gonna have to come back. And I'm like, and there was another one by a woman named Leslie. Okay, there. Those are my three. But it's funny that you mentioned going back to the 80s and 90s. So I also read a lot of science fiction as a child, and there used to be these constant, like, yearly collections. And I don't know if they were like the Hugo whatever collection, just random sci fi short story collections. And I had one as a teenager edited by Ursula K. Le Guin. I don't know if you know who that is. Okay. So that one was really good, and it had stories in it. She didn't write them, but she was the editor. She found them. And it was like some of those stories, I still think about lines of them today. Can't find that book. And there was another one that I want to say that Roger Zelazny edited. And same thing, like pieces of those stories are burned into my brain today. And every time I go to a used bookstore, I look for those anthologies and I can't find them. I don't know. And I do like the once a year Amazon search or Google search. So maybe it's about time to search for those again. But
I recommend eBay and antique malls. I get a lot of like going at antiquing places. Like sometimes people just have like these really weird book collections, and I found you brought up Ursula K. Le Guin. I'm just kind of nerding out now, so I'm gonna grab a book by her that I have. Let's see. Here it is. So I had never like seen this one by her, but this is The Lathe of Heaven.
oh yeah, I
And
read that.
I love like these older covers. I think they're really cool. And I have found like a couple of anthologies like going antiquing. I think they're in general anthologies. I don't know. I don't want to. We have access to like so much that I think anthologies have the potential to be a great source for people to find authors that they may not even like consider in the first place. Like,
No,
oh, this.
well, and also one of the things that struck me about the sci-fi ones is it's a way for editors to give a shot to writers who aren't going to get a contract for a novel by themselves. I mean, it's like if you're an unknown writer, you're an emerging writer, you've only had a few things in magazines. Yeah, maybe no one's going to give you that big contract like, oh, get a whole book by yourself, get a whole, short story collection by yourself. But you can certainly have one story in a collection. That was part of what I wanted to do with Houston Noir. Someone brought me Jenny Zhang is the author of Sour Heart. And if you're looking for old sci-fi, I'm going to do it again to you guys. The bookstore on Houston Avenue, owned by some of the nicest people in Houston. And I don't know the name of the bookstore. I want to say it starts with a K, but the bookstore on Houston Avenue over by Travis Elementary, Kaboom. Thank you. Kaboom Books, Kaboom. They have, every time I go in there, they have some old 70s sci-fi paperback that just warms my heart to see it. So that's a good source as well. All right, now that we're totally off track.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think as long as it's always books related, we're good. And it all links back together too, because we've also been talking about authors and authors that are featured in anthologies. And I did want to ask this final question that I have on this slide. One observation that I made that to me really stood out was that the majority of the writers in this anthology are women, which I very much appreciated, especially with a genre that's typically, thought of again being more masculine in terms of like the characters and even the content. Was that intentional or just it kind of just happened?
It kind of just happened. I was intentional about, okay, I'm going to lean in and tell you all a secret. Just don't tell anyone I said this. So you may have noticed that it took longer for Houston Noir to come out, like compared to other cities, right? I think they had already done Haiti Noir, like volumes 1 and 2 before they got to Houston. And I heard through the grapevine that was because the first few people they offered it to found a bunch of authors amongst their friends, and they all had sort of the same demographics. And they realized that if they wanted a diverse collection that represented Houston's diversity, they needed to pick someone different. So I asked a bunch of people I knew. I wanted to balance. It would have been easy to get a bunch of people exactly like me, you know, women who are half Mexican and half German and Welsh or whatever it is. But I tried to make sure it was diverse. And then just the way it shook out, it happened to be more women than men. I think there was a moment where it was evenly divided, and then one of the men couldn't couldn't turn in the story in time.
Right.
And I mean, for a split second, I was like, "Oh, is this not fair?" And then I thought, well, you know, how often are story collections mostly men? Oh,
Correct.
it's fair. It's fair
Yeah.
enough.
I agree as well. I'm not sure why my screen is frozen, but you can hear me, right?
I hear you.
Okay, we're gonna carry on.
And you're smiling nicely in your frozen screen.
Yeah,
If it were me, I would be frozen, you know, with my eye closed.
Thank you. Okay, so you've given us a lot of insight into your editorial process. Let's flipping it to folks, and you have spoken about this as well. Flipping it to folks who maybe are trying to get a feature, or have don't know like where to start in terms of like getting published. Like, would you recommend an anthology? Like, what resources, if you know of any, would help?
Mm, I mean, for sure, an anthology is good if you think you can. Okay, so it's going to be rare that someone invites you to be in an anthology and you already have a short story that's perfect for that anthology. That's not a common thing.
Right.
So I think it's worth looking out for anthologies if you're the kind of person that can quickly come up with an idea, you know, in regards to a prompt, which is kind of what an anthology is. It's almost like a writing prompt. Like, hey, I need a story about Houston and it has to be a noir story. Go. So if you're good at doing that, it's totally worth looking out for open calls. As far as being someone that would be invited, it's just so funny. It's like when I asked people to recommend authors to me, I knew that I was taking a chance on getting nothing but extroverts, maybe. I'm an introvert myself. So I would say if you want to be invited, you kind of have to network, or if not network, then build a reputation for yourself as someone who can deliver work quickly and on time and someone who is easy to work with. Um, what else? Some of the people I invited already had stories to submit, and some of them had never written noir, and some of them were reluctant to even try, but I just really wanted to see what they could do. So I said, just write me a story about the most, and again with the F word, the most effed up thing you can think. And it was funny because a couple of people I kind of had to chase where they were like, no, I can't do it. And then they hung up the phone and they thought about it and it just like flowed out of them. And they were like, oh my gosh, I came up with something.
Yes.
So treat it like an exercise. I don't, you know, it's hard to say. It's not like anthologies are like this merry-go-round of constant opportunity and you just reach out and grab it. I don't know how many are getting published. But it's just something to keep an eye out for. And hey, you know what? You can always submit an idea for an anthology to a publisher. You can always gather people you know. Maybe you know a lot of authors. Maybe you're not a writer, but you're a great editor. You have friends, you think of a clever theme, you pull together some stories, and then you submit that to an author. You're more proactive, right? Like, hey, what about an anthology of stories about COVID-19? Here they are. Here's half of them, and I can deliver the other half.
Yeah, that would actually be great.
I'm sure it's already happening. That was an easy throwaway idea because I'm sure there's already some about to be published, right? But there's nothing to stop you from submitting your own anthologies as well. You don't just have to wait for an editor to come along, right?
Yeah, that's very true. And I think, the way that the internet, sorry, my cat is deciding to join as well. I think the internet also kind of poses an interesting opportunity for folks to do self-publishing.
Totally.
And at least get their foot in the door that way. And there are quite a few folks that participate in our writing program that have like self-published things. We have another writer who has like a Patreon and releases stories on on their Patreon, which I found like very interesting as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I guess it's like really interesting because it feels like getting published is simultaneously like really, really wide and how you can go about it, but very narrow if you want to go with like traditional publishing.
I mean, it is narrow, but self-publishing is a really good avenue to, if you care about traditional publishing. We all know the story of the help, like, oh, she published it herself and then, it got picked up. I like to think of, going back to what you're saying about Patreon and different avenues for posting your work online. Think about how excited you are when you see your favorite YouTube people collab with other YouTube people. And think about how excited you are when you see like TikTok people, like, oh, here's my favorite TikTok person, and now they're on TikTok with some, whatever they call, what do they call it when TikTok people duo or share or whatever that stuff's called. So the way you get excited about that, if you're publishing your work online, if you build a collection with other authors, people are going to be excited. And also, that's a great way to get crossover fans, right? Like maybe if I want to collaborate with Stephen King online, then all his online fans are going to see my work, and my fans are going to see his work. Because, my fans have never heard of Stephen King, I'm sure. Oh, it looks like we may have lost connection. Can you still hear me, anyone?
Hi, Gwendolyn. I think Logan is having a little bit of a technical issue, so we'll hang around for a little bit and see if she can swing back around.
Okay. Unless you want to take over with questions.
Let's see.
I'm just worried about losing audience while we wait.
She's it looks like her computer has completely crashed, so I apologize. Oh, no. Let's see here. I don't see any questions just yet. So viewers at home, we do have a few viewers over on Facebook joining us. Let's see, perhaps it would be okay then maybe we can wrap it up, because I do believe that she's not going to be able to bring up her device in the moment, but
Are we still live streaming now?
We currently are still on. Let's do a quick outro, and then we can yeah, so let's see. Thank you everyone so much for joining Logan and Gwen Zepeda for our final Authorama event. We apologize for some technical difficulties on our end, but thank you for joining us. And if you would like to catch any more programs virtually or at your libraries, please visit www.hcpl.net for more events in the future. Gwendolyn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Bye everyone. Thanks for listening in.